Patricia Kitsky. In January 1956, near Great Falls, Montana, 18-year-old airman Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and 16-year-old Patricia Kitsky went on what should have been an ordinary date. The sweethearts were last seen enjoying a quiet evening together under the lights of a local drive-in theater. Neither would ever make it home. The next day, hikers stumbled upon Bogle's body near his car. He had been shot in the head, his hands bound tightly behind him. The grim scene pointed to a violent struggle with a killer who came prepared. A desperate search for Patricia began immediately. Her body was found the next day, shot, with signs showing she had suffered before her death. The 1956 investigation faced brutal challenges. Back then, forensic science was in its absolute infancy. With no witnesses and a remote crime scene, clues about who approached the couple were practically non-existent. Detectives questioned dozens of people, but they could never gather enough evidence to charge a suspect. Yet, as we will see, one crucial move by early investigators would change everything 60 years later. They collected and preserved a biological sample from Patricia, carefully following the protocols of that era. This evidence was carefully stored away as the case went cold. It joined thousands of other unsolved files across the country. The case remained dormant for decades as the original detectives retired and eventually passed away. Decades went by, and the families still lived with agonizing questions about who destroyed their lives. The town of Great Falls slowly moved on, but the file was never officially closed. In 2001, investigators tested the preserved sample using modern DNA technology. Scientists successfully built a genetic profile, but it hit a dead end in existing databases. The profile sat in evidence, waiting for a technological breakthrough. That break arrived in 2019 when Bodhi Technology, a genetic genealogy lab, took on the case. Armed with the 1956 profile, scientists uploaded the genetic information to public genealogy databases. From there, they constructed a reverse family tree, locating relatives of the mystery killer and working backward to find matches. The search pointed directly to Kenneth Gould, a man living in Great Falls back in 1956. Gould had no known connection to the victims and had lived a quiet, ordinary life. He moved to Missouri in 1967 and finally passed away in 2007, over 10 years before the DNA match was ever made. To verify this, detectives got DNA samples from Gould's children who fully cooperated with the team. The family DNA matched the profile left at the crime scene, proving scientifically that Gould was indeed there when Patricia was brutally attacked. His family was utterly shocked, having never suspected a single dark secret in their father's past. Since Gould was already dead, there could be no arrest, trial, or formal prosecution. The case was closed because the killer was named, but real legal justice remained out of reach. Detective John Cadner, who helped solve the mystery, spoke of how monumental this was, noting that for the first time in 65 years, they had a direction. Why he targeted Patricia and Lloyd remains a mystery to this day. There was no sign of robbery or any connection between Gould and the teens. It seemed to be a random crime of opportunity, though without the killer alive to question, this is speculation. Next, we're going to look at another cold case from the 60s that took decades to solve: Wayne Pratt. On June 12, 1963, 24-year-old Wayne Pratt was working his shift at a gas station in Winnebago County. His wife later found him covered by a blanket, having suffered 53 stab wounds. The sheer brutality shocked investigators. The massive number of wounds pointed to explosive rage rather than a simple robbery gone wrong. But the bloody scene also revealed that the killer had been hurt during the struggle. There was blood at the scene belonging to someone other than Pratt, showing the attacker had cut themselves during the violent encounter. Investigators locked away the evidence, hoping future science would one day unlock its dark secrets. Back in 1963, detectives eyed William Doxtater, a paroled local thief living in Bowler, Wisconsin, as their primary person of interest. Witnesses spotted him lurking near the gas station, and he already knew the victim, Pratt. But the case lacked the proof needed to charge him, and by 1968, the trail went entirely cold. In 2011, detectives finally dusted off the old files to take another look. They sent the blanket that had covered Pratt's body off for advanced DNA analysis, but the genetic sample was a messy tangle of multiple DNA profiles, completely baffling standard forensic tests. In 2015, Sorensen Forensics tried to untangle the profiles, but the results remained totally inconclusive. Once again, the murder case hit a brick wall. Strange tips kept trickling in, even one from a psychic in 2017, but the real breakthrough came between 2023 and 2024 when cybergenetics took over. This lab specialized in untangling complex biological mixtures using powerful software to dissect the blanket evidence. Their digital tools successfully separated each person's genetic code, building clean, individual profiles from the mess. To their shock, one profile directly matched William Doxtater, the original suspect from 1963. But Doxtater had died in 2022, escaping any final interrogation or trial. Still, this fresh genetic proof brought the cold, hard certainty that had escaped police for 60 years. Years earlier, in a 2018 interview before the science caught him, Doxtater swore he was innocent, though he did admit to hanging around the station where Pratt worked. District Attorney Eric Spar declared that if Doxtater were still breathing, they would have charged him with murder. The file was finally closed in July 2024, 61 years after Pratt's brutal death. A savage overkill of 53 stab wounds proved this was far deeper and darker than a mere robbery. While the true motive died with Doxtater, the victim's family finally found peace after decades of waiting. As you and I will see next, this incredible genetic technology can turn the impossible into absolute certainty. What happens when the cold evidence points to someone working inside the very building of the crime? Susan Galvin. In July 1967, 20-year-old Susan Galvin was working as a records clerk for the Seattle Police Department. They found her lifeless body inside an elevator in a dark Seattle Center parking garage, strangled to death. Finding one of their own murdered sparked a massive, desperate manhunt across the city. Technicians carefully gathered critical biological evidence left behind on Susan's clothing. Detectives sealed and stored this vital evidence, following standard 60-70s protocols. They knew its future worth, even if the tools to analyze it were decades away from existing. Although they interviewed hundreds of potential witnesses, every lead dried up and the case went cold. For 52 long years, the killer remained a phantom, leaving her family with painful questions that seemed destined to stay unanswered. Her brother Loring never knew who took her or why. Modern genetic genealogy changed everything. In 2018, detectives teamed up with Parabon Nano Labs to track the killer through family trees. They uploaded the DNA pulled from the old evidence into public ancestry databases. From there, genealogists began mapping out family trees using distant cousin matches. The genetic results pointed to a suspect with a mix of Polish and Native American roots. This crucial detail narrowed the search, guiding investigators directly to a specific suspect. His name was Frank Whippick, a security guard who had worked right there in the complex where Susan died. Whipe had died in 1987, long before this scientific breakthrough. To get absolute proof, detectives secured a court order to exhume his buried remains. Bone DNA extracted from his coffin matched the crime scene sample, proving he was the killer. Detective Ralph Norton, who helped finally solve the mystery, announced they were 100% certain they had found Susan's killer. He honored the 1967 detectives who kept the evidence safe, saving the truth for over 50 years. Why Frank Whippick targeted Susan Galvin remains a mystery. He had no prior criminal record, and there was absolutely no evidence of any connection between him and Susan. His job as a security guard gave him access to the parking garage where she was killed, making it a highly opportunistic crime. Susan's brother shared the complex emotions of the resolution, noting that 52 years later, they finally knew who was responsible, but they still had no idea why. It is a harsh reality in so many of these cold case resolutions. DNA can identify a perpetrator but cannot explain their motives, especially when the killer Whippick died long before he could be questioned. Since he was already dead, no trial or prosecution ever occurred. The mystery was solved only by naming the man responsible, but true justice remained out of reach. Detectives also found nothing linking Whippick to any other unsolved crimes. While investigators continue reviewing similar cold cases in the area, sometimes the killer lived even closer to the victim. In October 1970, 28-year-old Nancy Bennallack returned to her Sacramento apartment. She was a dedicated court reporter, engaged to a local public defender. Nancy looked forward to her upcoming wedding and building a bright future with her fiancé. But that evening would be her last. She was brutally attacked inside her home and stabbed over 30 times. The severity of the attack was horrifying, with the medical examination revealing the absolute brutality of her final moments. But the killer made one critical mistake during the violent struggle. He cut himself, leaving his own blood mixed with Nancy's at the crime scene. That blood trail would eventually solve the mystery. Although investigators in 1970 lacked the technology to analyze it, they carefully collected and preserved the samples, tucking them away as the investigation followed more traditional leads. Detectives first focused on Nancy's personal and professional life. Since she was a court reporter, she crossed paths with many dangerous people inside the legal system, and police wondered if one of those connections triggered the attack. But no suspects emerged, and the case went cold. By 2004, DNA technology had advanced enough to build a profile from the killer's blood. They uploaded it to CODIS, the national database, but it matched absolutely no one in the system. Even familial DNA searches, seeking out relatives of the mystery suspect, failed to yield any solid leads. In 2019, genetic genealogy finally provided the breakthrough. Detectives uploaded the DNA profile to public databases and began constructing family trees. That research pointed them to the unknown killer's relatives, ultimately leading police straight to Richard John Davis. Davis was Nancy's neighbor in the very same apartment complex. He lived just steps from her front door, giving him easy access to her daily routines and habits. The terrifying proximity of the killer was chilling, proving how someone so close could commit such a horror and completely get away with it. But Davis died in 1997, over 20 years before he was ever identified. He was never on the police radar back then, and there was no record of detectives ever interviewing him or considering him a suspect. Because he was already dead, a trial was now completely impossible. When District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert closed the case, she made sure everyone knew Nancy had never been forgotten. At the time, it stood as the oldest cold case ever solved in Sacramento history. Nancy's sister, Linda, thanked the dedicated detectives who worked this case for nearly 50 years, though the motive for the attack is still a mystery. Davis had no criminal record, and detectives couldn't find any prior connection or bad blood between him and Nancy. It seems to have been a crime of opportunity, but without the ability to question Davis, that remains pure speculation. Another case from Canada reveals a similar pattern: a killer who took a life and vanished. Yvonne LaRue. In November 1972, near Toronto, Ontario, 16-year-old Yvonne LaRue was reported missing. Her body was later discovered in King Township, just north of the city. The medical examination revealed she had suffered severe blunt force trauma before her life was brutally taken. Her body had been moved and dumped in a rural area, showing deliberate planning by the killer. In 1972, the investigation actively pursued every single lead. Investigators traced Yvonne's final steps before she vanished, and they questioned everyone who might have seen or spoken to her. Yet no real suspects emerged, and the trail eventually went cold. For 50 years, Yvonne's family lived in the dark. Still, York Regional Police kept the file open, reviewing the evidence as new forensic technology emerged over the decades. The department's focus on cold cases meant Yvonne was never forgotten, even as the decades rolled by. The breakthrough came in 2022 using investigative genetic genealogy. Preserved DNA from the crime scene was analyzed and uploaded to public genealogy databases. The family tree matches pointed investigators directly to a man named Bruce Charles Cantillon. Cantillon had a violent history of targeting women and had spent time in mental health facilities. His dark past revealed a pattern of dangerous behavior before he crossed paths with Yvonne. Investigators found no evidence they knew each other, suggesting a random, terrifying encounter that turned deadly. But bringing him to justice proved impossible. He took his own life in 1974, just 2 years after Yvonne died and nearly 5 decades before the DNA match. He died long before anyone had even suspected him of the crime. To confirm the match, detectives reached out to Cantillon's relatives, who willingly provided their own DNA samples for comparison. The familial match proved the crime scene DNA belonged to Cantillon, giving investigators absolute scientific certainty. Deputy Chief Alvaro Almeida of York Regional police described the killer's actions as completely ruthless. The way he dumped her body in a remote rural area far from where she vanished showed a level of cruelty that still haunts detectives 50 years later. Her family released a statement through the police, declaring she was never forgotten. The identity gave them answers to questions carried for 50 years, though it could never bring back what was stolen. At least they finally knew who did it, even if real justice was out of reach. His sudden death after the crime makes one wonder if his mind broke completely after what he did. While detectives found no links to other cold cases, they continue to review unsolved files from that era. Our next case features a couple whose lives ended inside their own home. Linda Bernhard. In November 1973, 24-year-old Linda Bernhard and her husband Clifford, also 24, were found dead in their Billings, Montana home. Both were strangled, and Linda was assaulted before she died. The brutal double murder shocked the quiet Montana town, sparking a massive manhunt. At the crime scene, critical biological evidence was carefully gathered and preserved. Detectives dug into the couple's lives, searching for anyone with a motive or the opportunity to strike. The evidence suggested Linda was the killer's main target, and Clifford was only murdered because he was there. Soon they focused on Seal Stan Caldwell, who was Linda's co-worker. He moved to Billings in 1964, working at the same warehouse where Linda was employed. This job put him close to her. But back then, police lacked the hard evidence to bring charges. Caldwell had a clean record, and without physical proof linking him to the murders, the case went cold. In 2004, modern DNA technology allowed police to build a genetic profile from the crime scene. They uploaded it to the national database, but found no matches. Standard police work had hit a wall, and the case stayed unsolved. The breakthrough arrived through genetic genealogy between 2018 and 2019. Parabon Nanolabs, experts in forensic genealogy, analyzed the DNA profile to build family trees using public databases. The genealogy research tracked down relatives of the unidentified DNA profile, pointing detectives directly to a man named Cecil Stan Caldwell. To lock in the match, detectives got a DNA sample from Caldwell's cooperative brother. This family DNA matched the evidence left at the crime scene, giving investigators ironclad, scientific proof of Caldwell's guilt. They worked at the same place, explaining how he might have singled her out as a target. But Caldwell died in 2003, 16 years before this breakthrough, never having been named as a suspect. In fact, there was absolutely no record of him ever being questioned about the murder. Because he was already dead, a formal trial was impossible. Still, Sheriff Mike Linder was relieved to finally give the family some long-awaited answers. Cold case investigator Monty Wallace called genetic genealogy the ultimate tool for solving these mysteries, highlighting how new technology has completely redefined what is possible in cold case investigations. As for why he attacked the Bernhards, that secret died with him. He had no criminal record, and detectives found absolutely no signs of bad blood between him and the victims. Sharing a workplace suggests he might have obsessed over Linda, but since police can never interrogate him, that is just speculation. Detectives dug into other unsolved crimes from that era, wondering if Caldwell was a serial predator, yet they found nothing linking him to other cases. It is a chilling reminder of how an ordinary person can commit a horrific crime, then live a completely normal life for decades. If you love these chilling true crime cases, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Yet one historic case stands completely apart from the others, not because of modern forensic science, but because of shocking confessions kept secret for decades. Her name was Irene Garza. In April 1960, the 25-year-old was a beloved schoolteacher in McAllen, Texas. Everyone in town knew her for her passion for teaching and her unwavering religious faith. On the night before Easter, Irene walked into Sacred Heart Catholic Church to confess her sins, a sacred ritual before the holiday. She would never come home. When she missed Easter Mass the next morning, her panicked family immediately called the police. An urgent search was launched, bringing together neighbors, police, and hundreds of volunteers who adored her. 5 days later, her body was found floating in a canal, with an autopsy confirming she had been beaten and suffocated. Clues at the scene made it clear she suffered terribly before she died. Detectives zeroed in on the last place anyone saw her alive, that very sanctuary where she confessed. A young, newly ordained priest named John Feit had heard her confession that evening. Under questioning, Feit gave conflicting stories about his timeline and had fresh scratches on his hands he could not explain. Later, police dragged a slide viewer belonging to Irene out of the canal, directly linking Feit to the crime. Even with all the glaring suspicion surrounding Feit, prosecutors refused to file charges back then. But only weeks after her death, Feit was arrested for assaulting another young woman, Maria America Guerra, at a nearby parish. He pleaded no contest, paid a small fine, and walked free. The Catholic Church quickly transferred him to another state, effectively shielding him from further scrutiny. As for Irene, the ultimate breakthrough did not come from DNA, but from confessions that Feit blurted out to others over the years. Feit admitted to two fellow priests, Dale Tcheny and Father Joseph O'Brien, that he had trapped Irene in the rectory, assaulted her, and choked her to death. High-ranking church officials knew about his confessions, but they kept them hidden from police for decades. In 2002, detectives tried to run DNA tests on the old evidence, but because her body spent 5 days submerged in a canal, the genetic material was completely destroyed. Prosecutors would have to build their case on witness testimonies, not forensic science. For over 50 years, Irene's heartbroken family fought for justice. Irene's relative, Nomi Pon Sigler, fought hard to reopen the case, declaring that Feit could not be allowed to get away with murder. The family's persistence, combined with a growing demand to hold powerful institutions accountable, finally reignited the investigation in 2016, more than 56 years after Irene's death. John Feit was finally arrested. He had long since left the priesthood, married, and had children, and was living in Arizona, volunteering for a Catholic group. His arrest thrust the case back into the spotlight, sparking hard questions about why justice had taken so long. The trial took place in 2017, and Feit was convicted of taking Irene's life with malice. Prosecutors relied heavily on the shocking confessions Feit had made to fellow clergy, alongside circumstantial evidence from the original investigation. Feit maintained his innocence throughout, insisting he was not the man who had harmed Irene. Sentenced to life, Feit died in prison in 2020 from heart issues, while his appeal was still pending. His death meant the legal process abruptly ended without a final appellate ruling. For Irene's family, the conviction offered a measure of justice, though it came far too late for many who had loved her. The Garza case stands apart from other cold cases because DNA evidence played absolutely no role in his conviction. Instead, it was the confessions Feit made to fellow priests, combined with circumstantial clues from the original files, that sealed his fate. This case proved that even without modern forensic breakthroughs, relentless persistence and a demand for institutional accountability can still bring about justice. Another chilling case would yield evidence pointing to a suspect still potentially alive. Margaret Beck. In August 1963, 16-year-old Margaret Beck, known as Peggy, was working as a counselor at a Colorado Girl Scout camp. Her sisters described Peggy as a vibrant, beautiful teen who loved life and was dedicated to mentoring the younger girls at camp. The secluded mountain camp was considered perfectly safe, a place for young girls to explore nature and build confidence. One night, a predator crept into Peggy's tent, assaulting and strangling her. Her life was stolen while other campers slept just yards away. The discovery of her body the next morning sent massive shockwaves through the camp and the entire community. How could anyone slip into this remote campsite, commit such a horror, and vanish undetected? The 1963 investigation hit wall after wall. The camp's isolation meant there were almost no witnesses, and the killer left very little clues behind. Endless interviews with staff, visitors, and locals led to dead ends. The case quickly went cold, leaving Peggy's family in agonizing silence. But detectives did recover crucial biological evidence from under Peggy's fingernails, proving she had fought hard against her attacker. This tiny sample was carefully preserved, even though the technology to analyze it lay decades in the future. In 2007, major advances in DNA technology allowed scientists to extract a genetic profile from that preserved fingernail evidence. This profile was run through databases, but found no matches. The case stayed cold, though that genetic footprint offered fresh hope of a future breakthrough. That breakthrough finally came in 2019 through genetic genealogy. United Data Connect, a forensic genealogy firm, analyzed the DNA profile and constructed massive family trees using public databases. The research pointed to relatives of the unknown killer, allowing detectives to narrow their sights on James Raymond Taylor. Taylor had lived in Colorado during the early 1960s, working as a television repairman in Edgewater. His job gave him total freedom to travel the region, including remote spots like the Mountain Scout Camp. He had no criminal record before this, making him a completely invisible suspect during the initial hunt. Unlike most cold cases solved by modern genealogy, Taylor's current status is a complete mystery. He was last tracked to Las Vegas back in 1976, but his whereabouts since then remain unknown. If still alive, he would be in his mid-80s. An arrest warrant was issued in 2020, and he remains a fugitive. Sheriff Jeff Schrader expressed his absolute determination to find Taylor, stating that nothing would bring his team more joy than putting handcuffs on him. The case remains. The case technically remains open, with detectives still chasing down any leads on Taylor's location or whether he is even alive. For Peggy's sisters, this identification finally brought the answers they had waited more than 50 years to receive. At last, they knew who had taken their sister, even if bringing him to justice remained out of reach. They remembered Peggy as a vibrant soul full of potential, whose future was stolen by a killer who has never been held accountable. As of late 2025, no updates have emerged regarding Taylor's location or arrest. This case represents one of the very few genetic genealogy cases where the suspect might still be alive and face prosecution if they are ever found. Metro Denver Crime Stoppers still lists the case as active, searching for any clues about Taylor's whereabouts or if he is still alive. The Beck case highlights both the incredible promise and the deep frustration of investigating cold cases. Although genetic genealogy successfully unmasked the killer after more than 50 years, actually bringing him to justice means tracking down a man who has spent decades evading the law. His warrant remains active, and detectives continue chasing down clues that might show where Taylor fled after 1976. Sometimes the key evidence is not DNA at all. Enter Everett Delano. Back in September 1966, 49-year-old Everett Delano was working at a New Hampshire gas station. He was shot 3 times during a robbery that netted between $75 and $100. The sheer brutality of shooting a man over such a pitiful amount of money strongly suggested the killer wanted to eliminate any witness who could later identify him. During the 1966 investigation, detectives managed to lift fingerprints off a faucet in the station's bathroom. But back then, fingerprint databases were incredibly limited, and the prints failed to match anyone in the system. With no name to go on, the case went cold. For decades, those fingerprints sat in storage, run against growing databases whenever forensic technology took a leap forward. The mystery lingered unsolved through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and right into the new millennium. The breakthrough finally arrived in 2013 when detectives ran those prints through the national database, AFIS. The system now held millions of prints from all over the nation. And this time, they got a hit: Thomas Cass. He was a career criminal with a record spanning decades. Between 1966 and 2000, he racked up 13 convictions, including armed robbery and theft. He faced charges for assault and prison escape. His violent history pointed to someone capable of killing a witness during a robbery. Cass had grown up in a deeply troubled home with an abusive, alcoholic father, an environment that researchers often link to later criminal behavior. When detectives confronted Cass in 2013, he flatly denied killing Delano. But his ex-wife painted a very different picture, recalling how he loved to boast about his various criminal exploits over the years. But that fingerprint put him right at the crime scene, shattering his lies. In 2014, before charges were filed, Cass took his own life after another police visit, ensuring there would never be a trial. Still, the physical evidence had conclusively proved he was the man inside the gas station during that violent robbery and shooting. Delano's family was deeply grateful to finally have answers, expressing their relief that they had lived to see at least a small measure of justice. But this truth arrived nearly 50 years after Everett's death, far too late for several relatives who died without ever knowing the killer's name. The resolution proved that solving a cold case does not always require DNA. Old-school fingerprint analysis, paired with modern databases and relentless police work, can still bring peace to families waiting in limbo. The New Hampshire Department of Justice announced the closure, reinforcing their promise to hunt down killers no matter how much time slips by. By taking his own life when the police closed in, Cash showed he knew the evidence was absolutely overwhelming. For decades, he lived a life of crime with no consequences until that 50-year-old fingerprint finally caught up with him. The case, it served as a grim reminder that decades-old evidence from cold cases can still point to a killer when run through modern databases. The next case exposes a repeat predator. His victim was a young woman named Wendy Jo Howison. In September 1968, 22-year-old Wendy Jo was an art student living in Los Angeles, California. On the day she died, she went out shopping and headed home. She never made it back to her apartment. They found her body strangled and beaten, the tragic victim of a monster who crossed her path that afternoon. Back in 1968, investigators collected biological evidence from the scene, hoping it might one day unmask her killer. But DNA testing did not exist in 1968, so the sample was carefully stored while police chased dead-end leads. With no witnesses or solid suspects, the trail went cold. For nearly 50 years, her murder remained a mystery. Her family was left to live with agonizing questions about who killed her and why. Meanwhile, the evidence sat in dark storage, waiting for the technology that could unlock its secrets. By 2016, genetic forensics had advanced enough that technicians could finally run the preserved sample. After extracting a genetic profile, scientists ran it through the national database. This time, they hit a match. Edwin Dean Richardson was no stranger to prison. He was a violent transient with a long history of crimes. In 1972, he was convicted of murder in Orange County, California, and handed a life sentence. In 1977, behind bars, he was linked to another brutal killing in Ohio. His horrific pattern pointed to a serial killer who targeted victims across several states. The cold case match officially added Wendy Jo to Richardson's long list of victims. But he would never face trial, having died in an Ohio prison in 2013, 3 years before the breakthrough. He spent his remaining decades behind bars for his other terrible crimes, but he escaped justice in this life for what he did to Wendy Jo. Detective Richard Benson, who solved the cold case, was relieved to finally give Wendy Jo's family some answers. He said it felt incredible to bring long overdue closure to a family waiting nearly 50 years for the truth. Detectives are still reviewing unsolved files from areas where the killer was known to roam. His history of predatory behavior suggests there are likely other victims yet to be linked to him. Identifying Richardson in this case proved how advanced DNA can bridge the gap between seemingly unrelated crimes, even decades after they happen. For her family, this resolution came far too late for those who loved her most. But the breakthrough finally answered the terrifying question that had haunted them for nearly half a century. Who stole Wendy Jo from them? This investigation also put a spotlight on the chilling reality of serial killers. Richardson had stolen multiple lives across several different states, yet Wendy Jo's murder went unsolved for nearly 50 years while he sat in prison for other crimes. If modern forensics existed in 1968, he might have been caught before claiming more innocent lives. Because of the delay, the killer served life behind bars for his other murders, but was never legally punished for taking Wendy Jo's life. How do investigators find justice when a killer uses multiple identities? Enter Terry Lynn Hollis. In November 1972, in Torrance, California, little Terry Lynn Hollis went for a bike ride near her home. She never returned. Her body was later found, the victim of a brutal assault before her life was stolen. The crime devastated the local community and triggered a massive, desperate police hunt. Due to the victim's young age, the graphic details of this tragedy will not be shared. However, investigators did collect and preserve biological evidence from the scene, holding on to hope that future technology would one day unmask her killer. Back in 1972, detectives chased down every single lead. Detectives swept the neighborhood, questioning anyone who had ever crossed paths with the victim. But every lead led to a dead end, and the investigation eventually went cold. For 47 years, Terry Lynn's family lived in agonizing silence. Her parents died without ever learning who stole their daughter. Her brother, Randy, grew up carrying the heavy burden of this unsolved mystery. In 2019, forensic scientists applied modern genetic genealogy to the preserved DNA evidence. The analysis successfully tracked down relatives of the mysterious killer. Detectives meticulously built family trees, eventually narrowing the search to Jake Edward Brown. Brown lived under fake names and constant address changes. This made him incredibly elusive. His rap sheet after the murder grew to include drugs, robbery, and 2 violent attacks on women. It was a chilling pattern, showing a dangerous predator who kept offending long after 1972. But Brown died in 2003, 16 years before the DNA match. To verify the genetic genealogy results, police secured a warrant to exhume his body in Arizona. DNA taken from his remains matched the 1972 crime scene, proving his guilt beyond doubt. Torrance Police Chief Paul Irvine called the horrific cold case the stuff of absolute nightmares. The breakthrough closed a case that had haunted detectives for 50 years, though it came far too late for her parents to ever find peace. Her brother, Randy, felt torn by the bittersweet news. He deeply wished their parents had lived to see justice. They carried that painful mystery to their graves, missing the breakthrough by just a few years. Detectives then began reviewing other unsolved cold cases, wondering if Brown was behind even more unsolved tragedies. His endless aliases and frequent moves showed a man running from the law, while his brutal record proved he never stopped hurting people. This case revealed both the strength and limits of genetic genealogy. The technology can unmask killers decades after their brutal crimes, but it can never restore a family's lost decades or put a dead monster behind bars. Our final case reveals a chilling personal connection between the killer and the victim's own family, Naomi Sanders. In February 1973, the 57-year-old was found dead in her Vallejo apartment. She had been beaten and strangled by an intruder who forced his way inside and took her life. Naomi worked as an apartment manager, a busy job that constantly put her in contact with the local community. In 1973, investigators gathered crucial biological evidence from the crime scene. They questioned every resident living in the building, along with Naomi's friends and anyone seen near her home. Yet no suspect emerged, and the case went completely cold. For over 40 years, Naomi's heartbroken family waited for answers. Her nieces grew up with the shadow of their aunt's murder, never knowing who did it or why. In 2014, advanced DNA technology allowed scientists to extract a clear genetic profile from the evidence. They ran the profile through national databases, but got 0 hits. The cold case remained frozen, waiting for a breakthrough. Then, between 2018 and 2019, experts applied genetic genealogy to the cold case file. The analysis located distant relatives, allowing investigators to carefully construct massive family trees. Incredibly, when they tested the DNA of a suspect's son, it matched the 1973 crime scene. It led them straight to Robert Dale Edwards. What police discovered next was deeply unsettling. Edwards' own father actually knew Naomi Sanders. This dark connection suggested that Edwards had obtained private details about Naomi through his father, earmarking her as an easy target because of that family connection. This familiar connection cast a highly disturbing shadow over an already heartbreaking tragedy. Edwards had a long, violent rap sheet, including theft, domestic abuse, and assault with a deadly weapon. He was even convicted of attempted murder, proving he was a dangerous man who spent decades terrorizing others. His violent criminal history proved he was more than capable of committing Naomi's murder. Edwards died of an overdose in 1993, over 25 years before the DNA match. During the initial investigation, he never once crossed the detectives' radar, and no records show he was ever even questioned about Naomi. With his death, any hope of a trial or prosecution vanished. Naomi's nieces in the Cadinger family shared that everyone who loved her could finally find a sense of peace. The breakthrough finally answered the haunting question of who was responsible, though it could never explain why he targeted Naomi or punish him in a courtroom. Her family clung to the hope that Naomi could truly rest, now that her killer had a name. For over 46 years, her death remained a dark secret. This new genetic science finally delivered the answers they spent half a century chasing. Detectives immediately searched other cold cases to see if Edwards had struck again, but they found no solid connections. The link between Edwards's own father and Naomi is still one of the most chilling parts of this mystery, hinting that she was targeted simply because she was close by and familiar. The Sanders investigation proved that modern DNA profiling can do more than just unmask a killer. It can also expose the hidden relationships that explain how a victim was chosen. The connection between Edwards's father and Naomi suggests her murder was far from a random act, but was likely made possible because of what he knew through his family's ties to her. For the investigators who spent decades on these 50-year-old cold cases, these breakthroughs brought both triumph and frustration. While science had finally advanced enough to give the killer a name, decades of lost time meant there was no way to put him behind bars. All that was left was the power to bring truth to families who had waited a lifetime, to finally unmask the monsters who had slipped away from the law while they were alive, and close files that had gathered dust for generations. That is all for today. Thank you for watching. Click here to check out another cold case.